Welcome to another episode and installment of Off the Glass. I'm your host, Cairo, and Off the Glass is a series on my channel, essentially like a podcast form where I talk about anything NBA related. And today I wanted to talk about this idea revolving around what does it mean to be a superstar. Similar to my first Off the Glass video on how I talked about being a generational prospect, being a generational talent, a player, and specifically focusing on the Cooper Flag dilemma and the player itself. Today I wanted to talk about what it means to be a superstar, what classifies, what defines you as being a superstar. Because quite frankly, I feel like every year the bar gets moved, and I think it's an interesting conversation to have. And to first start off, I wanted to say if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe to the channel. And I've struggled a lot personally with understanding what it means to be a superstar because my personal definition for a while was a superstar in the NBA is someone who, quite frankly, he elevates his team. He makes sure his team is playing on a completely different level. No matter how bad his team is, he's the basically their MVP. He elevates the floor and the ceiling of his players around him, and their consistent success in the regular season and leading into the playoffs and time in and time out again, they can show up. And usually when we look at guys who are superstars, they're usually you see guys at top who are more offensively gifted. We don't really tend to focus on the defensive side of the ball, which I sort of understand because you would rather have somebody who can score 50 points every night than, you know, play really good defense at the entire night, right? Somebody who can score 50 points, play no defense every night, and then as to somebody who scores 0 points and plays elite defense, right? You would rather pick someone like that. So I get that argument, but the reason why I'm struggling is because I feel like it does get moved a lot, right? And for a while, we can just go over the obvious superstars, guys that I have that I'm clear confident in that meet the criteria that I just mentioned were Giannis, Jokic, SGA, and Luka. I think these guys have showed time in and time out that they can have consistent success in the regular season and in the playoffs. They elevate their team's overall floor, and they just consistently show up. And it's been years and years. And I think what makes it difficult is I think for the last you know season and a half maybe. I mean, before SGA's MVP season, you could argue that he was entering the conversations, but now he's officially in, and he is a superstar. He also just signed that big contract. But it is difficult because with how I always looked at it, somebody who's a consistent superstar, right? He's only been, you know, truly the number one guy on the best team for about the last 2 years. And is that enough to reign being a superstar? But then you look at Jokic and Giannis, who have won championships and they have had playoff success. But in recent years, they haven't. And you can argue that is a lot on the, upper management and the team as a whole, the front office. But does that contribute to it as well? And Luka, he has made the finals. But, in terms of getting there and being, you know, always being the best player on both ends of the floor, he has struggled a lot. And I just always think it's a great conversation to have because, like I said, the bar keeps moving a lot. And it's just a dilemma that I really wanted to focus on. And I really wanted to go through a few superstars and guys who are either it in that fringe era of being a superstar, either entering or consistently entering and exiting, guys who are not there yet, that could be there yet, the young guys. And I think one thing I also wanted to note was that, like, in terms of marketing, I don't really care. I don't know why that's a thing. I think ESPN says that a lot in terms of, you can't be a superstar if you're not marketable. I think if you put up the production, the results happen, they would speak for themselves, right? I think like this market production of how like certain players, maybe like a Jason Tatum, is not as marketable as what some people would say. It's foolish and outlandish. I don't think that, but I think guys, those four guys, I can say I'm most confident in this season. I think those guys consistently put up MVP numbers. They've consistently been in MVP conversations probably for at least 2 years for now, 2 or more years, and they've consistently been there in the playoffs, helping their teams. And without them on the floor, their team isn't the best. Now you can make an argument for SGA, right? Because his team tends to be really good, even without him on the floor. They one of the best teams overall, defensive teams, and he's arguably the weakest link in that starting five. But they still play extremely well. They hide his defensive lapse, and that's not to say he's a bad defender, but it's just when I look at other guys potentially entering the conversation of being a superstar, how do these guys change it? And one dilemma I really wanted to focus on is someone like a Joel Embiid, someone who is clearly a superstar, fits almost any criteria you can match. He's probably the best superstar in terms of, besides Giannis, both ends of the floor, offensive and defensive production, right? A guy who is, there's a stat out there of him being the highest point per game per minute scorer in history, even overtaking Wilt Chamberlain. Somebody that has scored 70 on Victor Wembanyama. Somebody has put up 60, 50, while also being an elite rebounder and an elite defender. Athleticism through the charts. But then you look at the playoff success. And, you can kind of blame, maybe the front office. Maybe they haven't put the best team around him, but they consistently have tried to put good players around him. And he has played with good players, and he just hasn't performed in the playoffs. Barring that, and then having the injury concerns, is Joel Embiid a superstar? What classify him as being a super? Because I would personally put him in that conversation, but by my own metric and definition, does he deserve to be in it? With him consistently missing games, the constant knee surgeries, and the back and forth, him not being a player to lead his team, the Sixers struggled a lot without Joel Embiid. But you could also make the case as Joel sometimes hurts his team. Sometimes they, his ability to, especially in the playoffs, his ability to consistently turn the ball over and not be well, especially in the second round of the playoffs, is a big metric as to why the Sixers lose as well. He deserves some blame at least. But it just gives more into that conversation. Is Joel Embiid a superstar? How does he enter into that conversation? Or is he exiting? And I like that discussion because it really gives us time to think. Because if this is truly the criteria, and this is based on my own, I don't know how you guys or anybody watching would classify being a superstar, but like I said, that's who I see it as: somebody who elevates their team floor, consistent success, regular season playoffs, and has been there multiple years, have been consistently in MVP or close to MVP conversations, leading his teams to victory. And guys like him, Embiid, are either fringe, entering, or exiting. Guys like KD, Stephen Curry, Edwards, guys who are either are superstars, entering superstars conversations, or exiting, right? See, somebody like a LeBron could be in that conversation because he's slowly getting to that age where, he had his lowest point per game season in years. Now, he's still very productive, extremely productive, but it still pushes that criteria of, I see a lot of people saying, oh no, this guy's a superstar. Oh no, he's a superstar. But they don't really have the production. They haven't shown that for a consistent amount of years. Anthony Edwards, probably for the last 2 seasons, has really shown that he is entering in that superstar conversations. Or maybe he is to some people, right? But, guys like Kyrie Irving were superstars for a while. And then obviously Klay Thompson, these guys are exiting and, they're getting up there in age, which makes sense. So I think it's just an interesting conversation to have because I think consistency and availability will always matter. Anthony Edwards, I personally wouldn't classify him because I would say his recent stardom is not as, how do I say, not as on the level of SGA's. You could argue that him and SGA have been doing really well, probably for the last 2 seasons, entering in those conversations. But SGA has taken his team to higher levels and different heights. Granted, his team is better, of course, but they won the championship. They were there, and he was the number 1 player on the team. And I think it slowly gives into the fact that what do we value? Clearly Joel Embiid is on a superstar type of level play. He's not in that tier 3. He's closer to tier 1 and tier 2 as like the top players in the league than he is to a tier 3. But he's in that fringe and that weird little threshold. But then I've seen clips of guys saying Tyrese Halliburton is a superstar, and I'm sorry, I can't see it. He's definitely an all-star caliber player, but a superstar is that guy on the team. He's the guy with the it factor. He's not the guy to stray away from the ball, right? And that's not to say like Tyrese wants to do that, right? It's more to say that it's not his game. Sometimes he plays better when he's a pass first point guard. He's when he's taking the most shots on his team, yeah, he elevates and he helps his team, but I don't think he's there yet, right? And the Pacers, they've had also success for the last 2 seasons, but they haven't been super. Well, let me rephrase. Not the Pacers, but Tyrese Halliburton hasn't been super dominant. If you remember, very early on, for most of the beginning half of the season, Tyrese Halliburton was one of the worst players in the league. I can say that confidently. He was, to his standard, Tyrese Halliburton was playing awful. And there was videos all over the internet like, what is he doing? His efficiency has dropped. Everything has dropped. He's played horrible. And unironically, now he's one of the best players in the league because he has carried his team throughout the playoffs. You could also enter Jimmy Butler into those conversations in terms of he consistently, he'll show up in the regular season here and there, but there's a reason why playoff Jimmy is a thing because he can show up in the playoffs, but he consistently doesn't give you kind of that effort in the regular season. And, where is the bar? Does it keep getting moved? Who are the guys that are the real? Who are the guys entering these conversations or maybe exiting, right? Because I do think the clear cut is the Jokic, the Giannis, SGA, Luka. Those are the guys that right now are on pace that have carried their teams, to the finals before and have been there. But there are guys that are getting closer. I do think I'm very confident Edwards being in that conversation. And I think it's more of like once the Timberwolves get better and find their identity of who they are and, a true point guard, another, reliable second option, right? They have the defensive prowess. Granted, they lost Nickeil Alexander-Walker, but they have the defensive prowess. And I think once he starts getting to those higher seeds and being able to put the Timberwolves in better positions to succeed, I think Anthony Edwards will slowly be there. And it's just overall an interesting conversation to have. And I like where it's going, right? I like this ideal of, fans tend to believe like, I'm just looking at my notes. Fans tend to believe that a lot of players right now are superstars when they're a lot past their primes. A lot of people still deem Kyrie as a superstar. And a lot of people keep deeming, not Clay anymore, but before Clay, guys that are past their primes. And you could argue that I really don't think LeBron is a superstar. He's exiting those top 5. He's been exiting those top 5 conversations. And it's kind of crazy because, I've watched him almost my entire life, and he's literally been the best player in the world for a while. So, and that's not to say he's bad. He's nowhere near bad, right? He's still in these top 10, maybe top 15 conversations. But, I think it's easier to have a definitive definition of what it means to be a superstar rather than just randomly looking at these guys, what I've done for the entire season and then mold it into one, right? Because, like I said, LeBron and Kyrie aren't superstars anymore. KD and Curry, I would say they're always on that fringe, entering into exiting because, they're getting up there in age, but they still put up the production like a superstar. They're just not in those conversations, those MVP conversations, those, highest 1 seed conversations anymore. And I really like where it's going. I do. I think these guys, this is the future of the league. Arguably, it's crazy because the top 4 guys are international. None of these guys are American talent. And, you can make the argument that, maybe that hurts the game. I don't think it does. I really don't. But some people will say it does. You need an American face to be the face of the game. But it's not that deep. I think the NBA will put up the production and results. And, it's really difficult to just get into these arguments with people or these discussions, I would say, of like guys who should have been superstars maybe, or guys who aren't anymore, right? And you could look at guys like Derrick Rose, guys that have been superstars, have consistent success, but they're no longer superstars, right? Does that put them as one of the best of all time, of being at their peak production? You could argue those are different conversations to have. Those are really fun conversations to have. Guys who are have been at their peaks, who's been the best, right? You could really argue that Jokic has been one of the best offensive players of all time in terms of just everything offense, not just um, scoring. His efficiency on the scoring end is insane, just insane efficiency, and his ability to pass the ball, read the defense, just consistently put his teammates in the right spot. It's great. He's been the best player in the league for a while, and he probably should have won his like third or fourth MVP, right? Probably his fourth. I can't remember how much he has, but overall, I wanted to know your guys' opinion. I wanted to know others' opinions about what it means to be. What is your definition of a superstar? I'll reiterate myself again. I see a superstar as somebody who meets the criteria of consistently in MVP conversations, guys that elevate their teams, guys that raise their floors and ceilings, that are consistently winning in the regular season and in the playoffs. Both matter, right? And they're consistent in winning in the playoffs for multiple years. This is consistent over a number of years, which is why I wanted to make this video of what exactly it means to be a superstar. Because quite frankly, it's difficult to get in those conversations when a clear-cut guy like Joel Embiid, who's offensively out of this world and defensively one of the best in the league, can't enter those conversations because of injury concerns and inconsistency in the playoffs. But he's clearly a superstar, right? What did you think? Other guys as well. Jalen Brunson is a great example. Somebody who is clutch. One of the clutchest players in the league. I'm pretty sure he won clutch player of the league, right? Consistently shows up in the regular season and in the playoffs. And I do think if he were in a situation where, well, actually, no, I don't think that. He's around 7th every year in like MVP conversations. And I do think the guys above him are better than him, right? But it's interesting, right? And I like it because I completely forgot to mention Jason Tatum. Jason Tatum, you could, like, why isn't he more in these conversations being a superstar? And I really do think, I'm not going to lie, hate is a part of it. Like, a lot of people see Jason Tatum as somebody who's really corny, which I can kind of see. But somebody who's really corny and isn't like a loud presence, right? When you look at the top 4 guys, Jokic isn't a loud presence, but he's the number 1 player in the world. Like, you kind of have to know that, right? This is the first year where SGA is really getting like love, and Jason Tatum, his resume is stacked, and yet he's never like, I've never heard him really be in these conversations of being a true superstar or the face of the league at least, right? And you could argue Jason Tatum is the face of the league. His resume is unmatched. For somebody that young, being to that many conference finals appearances and winning like an NBA championship, it speaks for itself. And I think we probably need to respect Tatum a little bit more. And, he does meet my criteria. So I could put him as a, tier 1 superstar. I might actually. But it just feels weird. Like, if I'm being honest, a little bit unhinged. When I look at superstars and stuff like that, I think clearly the 4 guys, like I said, are Jokic, Giannis, SGA, and Luka. But it feels like, I'm not basing this off anything. This is solely thought right now. But, like, when I look at Tatum, clearly, based on the definition I gave, he clearly meets that criteria. But he doesn't feel like he's on the same level as Luka, SGA, Giannis, or Jokic. And to be honest, maybe it's because of the team around him, right? He has won a championship, but for a while, those teams, he has made it to the conference finals, and the finals twice. That's more than SGA. That's more than Luka. It's more than those guys. So, it just feels weird. Because certain guys, like Joel Embiid is obviously not, like, he's not on the same superstar level as those 4 players, but he's clearly, in terms of production, when he's healthy, he's there, right? So, either way, that's one thing I really wanted to discuss. I know I was just randomly yapping about a bunch of stuff, but I wanted to, like, go over what this means and overall how does it affect the league and, like, how many superstars are in the NBA, like, real superstars. That's my definition. I love the NBA. I love watching it. And overall, I think it's great to have these conversations in terms of who these guys might be in the future, who are exiting and entering these conversations. And I know Bradley Beal just got bought out and is on the Clippers, and I'll make a random video about that, about just going over the Western and Eastern Conference. But thank you. If you haven't yet subscribed, overall, I wanted Off the Glass is a series about where I talk about anything kind of on my mind NBA related that isn't on the realm of what's happening right now, right? Just something that's randomly on my mind. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe.